Imagine you're standing in front of a grill. You have a fresh cut of meat right in front of you. It looks perfect. It smells incredible. The fat is starting to render at the edges, and there is that small hiss every time a drop hits the coals underneath. You have done this 1,000 times. You cook it. You sit down. You eat. It is one of the most unremarkable moments a human being can have. And that is exactly what makes it interesting. Because underneath that unremarkable moment is a decision so old that you never actually got to make it yourself. Here is a question that will feel strange the first time you hear it, and then it will not leave you alone. Why was that meat from a cow and not from a lion? Not from a wolf? Not from a tiger? Not from a shark? We hunt animals. We have hunted animals for as long as we have existed as a species. We eat animals constantly, without ceremony, without hesitation, 3 times a day in some cases. But something stops us at a very specific point on the food chain. Something draws an invisible line, and every culture on this planet, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of years with zero contact with each other, somehow drew that line in almost exactly the same place. Most people, if you ask them, will say it is cultural, a taboo, something we just do not do, the same way we do not eat with our hands at a formal dinner or do not talk during a funeral. But that answer is only the surface layer, and surface layers are almost never where the real story lives. Underneath the culture, there is a biological reason. Underneath the biology, there is a chemical reason. And underneath the chemistry, there is something buried so deep in your evolutionary memory that your body already knew the answer to this question long before any scientist ever wrote it down. Stay with this all the way to the end, because the last part of this story is not really about predators at all. It is about you and what you are actually made of, and why a feeling you have never questioned turns out to be one of the oldest pieces of information you carry. Let us start with the most obvious version of the question. Could you even eat a lion if you wanted to? The honest answer is yes. The meat itself is not poisonous in the way a death cap mushroom is poisonous. You would not take one bite and collapse. This is not a fictional boundary, and it is worth being precise about that, because the story only gets interesting once you understand that the barrier is not simple toxicity. Some people, across history, have eaten lion. Central African hunting communities have occasionally consumed lion meat, particularly the meat of animals killed in conflict situations where livestock had been attacked. Arctic hunting cultures, including certain Inuit and other circumpolar groups, have eaten polar bear, one of the largest land predators on Earth, as a documented part of traditional subsistence practice, though always with specific and very deliberate preparation rules passed down through generations. There are historical accounts of wolf being eaten during famine conditions in parts of Europe and Asia. There are accounts of bear, alligator, and shark appearing on tables across dozens of cultures throughout history. So, the biological option exists. Nobody is stopping you at the level of pure chemistry. And yet, across the full sweep of human civilization, spanning every continent, every climate, every era from the Paleolithic to right now, almost no culture ever built a lasting food tradition around eating apex predators the way cultures built traditions around cattle, or goats, or chickens, or pigs. That absence is the mystery. And the explanation for that absence turns out to be one of the most elegant and interlocking laws in all of biology. It is called the 10% rule, and once you understand it, you will never look at a food chain the same way again. Here is what it means, stated as simply as possible. Every single time energy moves up one level in a food chain, roughly 90% of it disappears. Not gets hidden, not gets stored somewhere. Disappears converted into heat, burned off through movement, breathing, digestion, staying warm, staying alive. A blade of grass captures energy from sunlight through photosynthesis. That energy sits inside the plant. A deer eats that grass, and of all the energy that grass contained, the deer only manages to retain about 10% of it inside its own body as usable tissue. The other 90% is gone, spent on the enormous metabolic cost of simply being a living, moving, breathing animal. Now a lion eats that deer. The exact same tax applies. The lion only keeps about 10% of the energy that was inside the deer, which means if you trace the numbers all the way back to the original sunlight, the lion is running on roughly 1% of the energy that hit that blade of grass in the first place. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. A lion needs to consume somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds of meat in a single day just to maintain its own body, just to survive, not to thrive, not to grow, simply to keep existing. That is an enormous cost, an enormous quantity of prey animals converted down into just enough energy to keep one predator alive for 24 hours. Now, put yourself back roughly 200,000 years, standing somewhere on the African savanna, hungry, and facing a genuine choice. Do you spend your limited time, your limited strength, and risk your actual life confronting an animal that is faster than you, stronger than you, armed with teeth built specifically for tearing flesh, all in exchange for 15 pounds of low-energy meat sitting at the very top of a system that has already burned off 99% of its original value? Or do you hunt the deer directly, skip several rungs of that energy ladder entirely, and walk away with meat that costs you dramatically less danger for dramatically more caloric return? The math was never subtle. It was not a close call requiring careful calculation. It was blindingly, overwhelmingly obvious, and it stayed obvious for every single hunting generation that followed. This is a concept researchers studying ancient human diets now call optimal foraging theory, formalized in ecological literature starting in the 1960s by biologists including Eric Charnoff and Robert MacArthur, who modeled exactly how animals, including humans, allocate their limited time and energy toward food sources that deliver the best possible return. Every apex predator on the planet represents the worst possible return on investment available in any given ecosystem. You go for the prey, not the predator. That single principle, quietly running in the background of every hunting decision ever made, is the first brick in the wall between you and a wolf steak. But the energy math is only half the story, and honestly, it might not even be the more important half, because the other half of the story is invisible, and it is sitting right now inside the tissue of every apex predator alive on Earth. It is called biomagnification, and once you understand how it works, you will realize your ancestors were protecting you from something they could not see, could not name, and could not have explained even if you had handed them a microscope. Here is the mechanism. Toxins enter a food chain at the very bottom, usually in forms so diluted they barely register as dangerous. Heavy metals seep into soil and water. Industrial pollutants settle into rivers and oceans. Plants absorb trace amounts through their roots. Tiny organisms filter these compounds out of water as they feed. None of this on its own is enough to hurt anything. A single small fish eating thousands of these tiny organisms absorbs a small dose of toxin with each one. Not nearly enough to cause harm, but the compound does not break down easily, so instead of passing through the fish's body, it accumulates in fat tissue. Now, a larger fish eats thousands of these small fish over its lifetime. Each one carried its own small dose. Multiply that by thousands, and the concentration inside the larger fish is now measurably higher than it ever was at the bottom of the chain. Then a genuine predator fish eats thousands of these medium-sized fish across years of hunting, and the concentration climbs again, compounding at every single step. By the time you reach the very top of a food chain, the concentration of these toxins is not just slightly elevated. It can be measured in the millions of times higher than the levels present at the bottom of the same ecosystem. This is not a hypothetical model sitting in a textbook somewhere. This has been directly measured, directly documented, and it changed environmental science forever. In 1966, a zoologist named Charles Worster, working with researchers studying declining bald eagle populations around the Great Lakes and the eastern seaboard of the United States, began investigating why eagle eggs were failing to hatch. The eagles were not being poisoned directly by any single source. They were simply doing what eagles do, eating fish. But those fish had spent their entire lives absorbing a pesticide called DDT that had been sprayed across agricultural land for decades, and that DDT had climbed the food chain exactly the way biomagnification predicts, becoming concentrated at every single link, until by the time it reached the eagles at the very top, the dose was severe enough to interfere with calcium deposition, causing eggshells so thin they cracked under the simple weight of a nesting parent. Worster's research became part of the foundational body of evidence behind Rachel Carson's warnings, and eventually contributed to DDT being banned for agricultural use in the United States in 1972. The eagles were not dying from what they ate. They were dying from everything their food had already eaten, compounded across an entire chain before it ever reached them. You have already felt the edge of this yourself, even if you never connected it to this exact mechanism. You have probably been told at some point to be careful about how much tuna you eat, particularly larger species like big eye or albacore, and particularly if you are pregnant. This warning exists specifically because tuna are large predatory fish, sitting high enough on the oceanic food chain that mercury, absorbed by countless smaller organisms below them across years of hunting, has concentrated inside their tissue to levels worth monitoring. Public health agencies, including the United States Food and Drug Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency, maintain specific consumption guidelines built entirely around this trophic position. Now take that same logic and apply it to a land apex predator, an animal that has spent not months but potentially decades sitting at the absolute top of an entire terrestrial food web, accumulating mercury, lead, PCBs, and a long list of synthetic industrial compounds that the mammalian body has no efficient mechanism for breaking down or expelling. Research on polar bears, one of the very few apex predators humans have any sustained historical dietary relationship with, has documented some of the highest concentrations of persistent organic pollutants ever recorded in any land mammal on Earth. A direct consequence of sitting at the top of an Arctic marine food chain that funnels toxins upward through seals, through fish, through generations of accumulation. This is precisely why traditional Inuit knowledge, developed over thousands of years with no access to toxicology, specifically excludes polar bear liver from consumption entirely. The liver concentrates vitamin A to levels that are genuinely dangerous to humans, capable of causing a condition called hypervitaminosis A, with documented historical cases of severe illness and even death among explorers who ignored this rule. Nobody in that tradition had a laboratory. They had generations of careful observation, and they encoded the danger directly into cultural practice, into a rule that simply said, "Do not eat that part," without ever needing the biochemistry to explain why. And that is before parasites even enter the conversation, which is its own separate and equally serious layer of danger. Predators, by the nature of what they eat, consume raw flesh constantly, and raw flesh is exactly the environment in which parasites specialized for carnivore hosts thrive and reproduce across evolutionary time. The most well-documented example is a microscopic roundworm called trichinella. It lives coiled inside the muscle tissue of carnivorous and omnivorous animals. When a human eats infected meat that has not been cooked to a sufficient internal temperature, the larvae survive digestion, mature inside the intestine, and then migrate directly into the human body's own muscle tissue. The resulting infection, trichinosis, causes severe muscle pain, facial swelling, fever that can climb dangerously high, and, in serious historical cases, death. Bear meat remains one of the most consistently documented sources of trichinella infection in modern medical literature, precisely because bears sit high on the food chain, and their meat has historically been consumed by hunters in North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. Every single culture that maintained a tradition of eating bear developed, without exception, an absolutely rigid rule around thorough cooking. Not because thorough cooking improved the flavor, because the consequences of skipping that step were brutal, visible, and immediate enough that the lesson never had to be taught twice within a community. Now scale that up to a genuine apex predator, an animal that may have spent 15, 20, even 30 years at the very top of its ecosystem, accumulating not one but potentially dozens of parasite species specifically adapted to carnivore hosts, layered on top of the heavy metal and industrial toxin load already discussed. Your digestive system, your liver, your immune system, none of it evolved with a reasonable expectation of processing that combined burden on any kind of regular basis. It was simply never meant to be a normal part of your diet, and the accumulated risk explains, in cold biochemical terms, why the option quietly disappeared from nearly every food culture on the planet. But here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because there is a force operating in this story that is even older than the chemistry, something that took shape inside the human mind long before anyone understood biomagnification or parasite loads or the 10% rule. It is disgust. And disgust, it turns out, is not the crude, purely cultural reaction most people assume it to be. Researchers studying the psychology of food have found something remarkable when they look closely at how humans react to the idea of eating carnivorous animals. The aversion shows up early, appearing in children well before they could possibly have absorbed any explicit cultural teaching about it. It shows up consistently across cultures that developed in near total isolation from one another, separated by oceans, by millennia, by entirely different belief systems, entirely different religious frameworks, entirely different culinary traditions, and yet arriving at strikingly similar reactions to the same basic category of animal. Paul Rosen, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania who spent decades building the foundational research on disgust as a distinct human emotion, documented how humans categorize the flesh of carnivorous animals as aversive at what he described as an almost pre-rational level, a reaction that fires before conscious reasoning has a chance to weigh in. The explanation that has emerged from this research is evolutionary, not merely cultural. Ancestors who felt nothing, who approached a dead predator with the same casual appetite they brought to a dead deer, occasionally paid for that indifference with toxin exposure, with parasite infection, with illness that could kill before the cause was ever understood. Ancestors who instead felt a gut-level resistance, an unexplainable reluctance, an instinctive recoil from the idea long before they had any framework to justify it, simply survived at higher rates. That feeling, useless as it might have seemed to the individual experiencing it, kept passing down, generation after generation, precisely because it worked. You inherited it. Right now, if you picture yourself sitting down to a plate with a wolf steak on it, something in you reacts before your conscious brain has even finished processing the sentence. That reaction is not etiquette. That is not table manners passed down from a cookbook. That is millions of years of ancestors who survived the exact situations that quietly eliminated the ones who felt nothing. Now here is the twist worth sitting with, because the boundary is not actually absolute, and the exceptions turn out to reveal the underlying rule with even more clarity than the rule itself. Humans do eat certain predatory animals, just carefully, and just at specific points along the spectrum. Predatory fish appear in diets worldwide, but almost always with some form of built-in caution, portion limits, species selection, or preparation method that manages the accumulated risk. Alligator meat is consumed across the southern United States and parts of Asia, but alligators, despite being fearsome hunters, sit at a lower trophic position than a land mammal like a wolf, and are typically harvested relatively young, before decades of bioaccumulation have had time to build up. Bear, as already discussed, appears in several traditional diets, but is bound by strict, non-negotiable cooking practices developed specifically to manage the parasite risk. Shark appears in select culinary traditions, though frequently in contexts such as fermented or heavily processed preparations, that historically also serve to reduce specific chemical risks like the high urea content in shark flesh. And squid and octopus, genuinely ferocious hunters within their own marine ecosystems, are consumed constantly and without hesitation across dozens of cultures, precisely because their lifespans are extremely short, often only 1 to 2 years, which means there is simply no extended window of time for either toxins or parasites to meaningfully accumulate inside their tissue. The pattern that emerges from every single one of these exceptions is not that predators are categorically forbidden. The pattern is that risk climbs steadily the higher and the longer an animal has sat at the top of its food chain. And human food culture, entirely without access to modern toxicology, somehow calibrated itself with remarkable precision around exactly that curve. The animals at the very top, the lions, the wolves, the orcas, the tigers, the animals that have spent entire adult lifetimes concentrating everything that passed through every level of their ecosystem beneath them, are not simply animals in the way a deer or a cow is an animal. In a very real biochemical sense, they are archives, living records of every toxin, every pollutant, every parasite that moved through their environment across the full span of their lives, all of it compressed, stored, and waiting inside a single body. Eating that body means consuming the archive in its entirety, all at once, and your ancestors, without laboratories, without microscopes, without a single word for chemistry, arrived at the correct answer anyway. They arrived at it the only way pre-scientific knowledge ever traveled reliably across generations. They encoded it as a feeling. They made it feel wrong long before anyone could explain precisely why. There is one more piece of this that almost never gets discussed, and it explains something you have probably never thought to question, which is why entire global agricultural systems were built exclusively around herbivores. Every major livestock species that anchors human food production worldwide, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, are either strict herbivores or largely plant-based omnivores. This is not a coincidence, and it is not simply a matter of temperament or ease of domestication, although both of those factors matter too. It comes back once again to the same 10% rule sitting underneath everything else in this story. Raising a herbivore for meat means capturing energy just one step removed from plants, the most efficient and least costly point possible on the entire chain. Raising a carnivore for meat, by contrast, would require growing enormous quantities of prey animals first, feeding those prey animals to your predator, and then finally harvesting a fraction of the original energy that went into the entire system. Feed conversion ratios, a standard metric in modern agricultural science, measuring how many pounds of feed are required to produce 1 pound of body weight, are dramatically better for herbivorous livestock than they could ever be for any carnivorous species raised at scale. A farming system built around lions would require, roughly speaking, 10 times the agricultural land, 10 times the water, 10 times the total resource investment of a system built around cattle just to produce the same quantity of usable meat. Civilization did not simply avoid farming predators out of squeamishness, it avoided farming predators because doing so would have been catastrophically, mathematically inefficient, an economic impossibility disguised as a dietary preference. So here's the full picture, all of it interlocking, all of it pointing toward the same conclusion from completely different directions. The energy math told your ancestors that hunting a predator was an enormous gamble for a pathetic caloric reward. The chemistry, invisible and undetectable without modern instruments, quietly loaded every apex predator with concentrated toxins and parasites that could sicken or kill. The economics of agriculture made farming carnivores at any meaningful scale essentially impossible. And underneath every one of those separate, independently discovered reasons, evolution had already installed a feeling, a purely instinctive recoil that kept humans away from the danger long before any of them understood a single piece of the science behind it. Every animal you have ever casually eaten, the chicken on your plate last night, the beef in that grilled cut you have cooked 1,000 times, the fish on your table last weekend, every single one of them sat low enough on its respective food chain that the toxin load stayed survivable, the parasite risk stayed manageable, and your ancient, inherited disgust response simply never had a reason to fire. The food sitting in your kitchen right now, the food you never think twice about, is the end result of millions of years of accumulated survival pressure, quietly filtering out almost every dangerous option long before you were ever born to make a single choice about any of it. You did not select your diet at random out of an infinite menu of possibilities. Your entire culinary tradition, everything you consider normal, was shaped by a survival logic so old it predates language itself. So old it predates fire, so old it predates the earliest humans who could have explained any of it out loud. Now go back to that grill, look at the meat sitting in front of you again, the same meat from the very beginning of the story. It is not simply food, it is the surviving branch of an evolutionary decision tree, the one option that made it all the way through millions of years of energy math, invisible chemistry, parasite exposure, and inherited instinct without ever getting pruned away. And somewhere at the very top of every food chain on this planet, the lions, the wolves, the orcas, the animals you will never see on a dinner table anywhere in the world, sit exactly where danger has always lived, at every single level in every single form. Your ancestors never wrote a warning label. They never needed one. They simply passed down a feeling, and that feeling turned out to be exactly right every single time, for longer than written history has even existed. And you are sitting here today, eating exactly what you are eating, because somewhere back along that impossibly long chain of ancestors, it worked. Before you go, I need your honest opinion on something. You just watched a brand new character in this video. This is the first time I've used it, and I genuinely don't know if it worked. So tell me, did it feel right for this channel or did it feel off? Should I keep building videos around this character or should I go back to the drawing board? And beyond the character, where did this video lose you? Was the pacing too slow somewhere? Was a part boring? Should it have been shorter or longer? Was the voice okay? Be honest, even if it's harsh, I can only fix what I actually hear about. I make every single one of these videos from my phone. No laptop, no PC. I'm a student doing this between everything else, and I'm still figuring this out one video at a time. So whatever mistake you catch, tell me in the comments. I read every comment, and I reply to the best one personally. Honestly, I try to reply to all of them, and if 10 of you ask for the same next topic, that's the one I make next. New video in a day or two. See you there.